Transmission arrived at 4:17 station time, while I was halfway through my second cup of bad coffee and reviewing the overnight telemetry from 7. I had been watch officer on Bastion Kestrel for 11 years by then. 11 years of watching the deep scan arrays sweep the outer approaches, micrometeorite clusters and the occasional dead probe from the early survey era, filing the quarterly readiness report that Commander Yevlenova signed without reading because nothing ever came through the outer approaches that required more than a notation. The arrays were a formality most people in the civilian districts below believed, a monument to old anxiety. There had been political movements, twice in my career, to decommission the outer watch platforms entirely and redirect the funding to the coastal reclamation projects. Both times the Defense Compact had declined, quietly and without public debate, because the Defense Compact knew things the political movements did not. I knew them too. Every watch officer on every platform in the Kestrel Ring knew them. We simply did not discuss them at civilian dinner tables. At 04:17, the Deep Scan Array, designated Outer Watch Lima 9, registered a gravitational displacement signature, 11 light minutes beyond the lunar marker. The profile was not a comet, it was not debris. The mass shadow it cast on the array was consistent with a fleet of vessels. The displacement algorithm estimated between 60 and 80 hulls, each in the mass range of a heavy transport or warship, decelerating from a high transit velocity on a vector aligned, with a precision that could not be accidental, with Earth's position. I set down the coffee, cross-checked Lima 9 against Lima 8 and Lima 11. All three arrays confirmed. The displacement profile was clean, deliberate, organized, multiple hulls holding formation during deceleration. That last detail told me more than the mass shadow did. Random debris does not hold formation. A salvage drone cluster does not decelerate on a coordinated vector. Whatever was coming through the outer approaches had a navigation system, command structure, and a destination it had chosen. I opened a direct channel to Commander Yevlenova. She answered in 4 seconds, told me she had been awake already. I gave her the Lima 9 reading and the cross, without editorializing. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not hesitation but calculation. "Send it up the chain," she said. All tears now. Sent it up the chain. 12 minutes later, every orbital platform in the Kestrel Ring was at condition 2. 6 minutes after that, the Defense Compact's deep space communication relay picked up the first signal from the incoming fleet. Not a beacon, not a distress code, but a structured transmission on a frequency that the Compact's signal library identified in under 90 seconds. The library was very old. Older than the platform I was standing on. Older than the Kestrel Ring itself. The signal matched a contact frequency used by the Veth Ascendancy, the last contact frequency. The one logged in the archive files from the abandonment 32,000 years ago. I had read about the abandonment in the platform's historical archive, the way you read about an earthquake that destroyed a city you've never visited. As a fact, not as something that had happened to people. I knew the broad record, that the Veth Ascendancy had held Earth as a resource territory for approximately 4,000 years before they left, that their departure had been abrupt and unexplained, that the human population, at the time of their departure, had been reduced by methods that the archive described in clinical language I had trained myself to read without flinching. I knew the record. I did not know the weight of it the way the people who built the first defensive fortifications, after the abandonment, had known it. Those people had been dead for 30,000 years. But they had built the fortifications, and the people after them had built more, and the people after them had built still more. And so it had continued. Not from fear exactly, but from something older and more durable than fear, memory. The understanding that a thing which has happened once has demonstrated that it can happen again, and that the only rational response to that understanding is preparation. The Compact had been preparing for 32,000 years. At 05:44 station time, 87 minutes after the Lima 9 reading, the incoming fleet crossed the lunar marker, and our active scan arrays lit them, up in full resolution, 71 hulls. The lead vessel was enormous, longer than anything in the current Veth configuration that our intelligence files held, which meant either the Ascendancy's shipbuilding technology had advanced significantly in 30 millennia, or the files we had were older than their most recent hull designs, which was almost certainly true, given that our last verified Veth contact had been the abandonment itself. The lead vessel was flanked by what appeared to be 8 heavy escorts, each roughly equivalent in mass to one of our own Meridian-class battle cruisers, though the silhouette was unmistakably Veth. That characteristic swept-back geometry, the ring emitter arrays along the ventral hull, the command blister forward of center, that was not a bridge in the human sense but a collective perception node, a design feature that their biology required, and that our engineers had studied in archived records for centuries. Behind the escorts came a second tier of what the scan analysis classified as enforcement carriers. 14 of them, box-shaped and heavily armored, each capable of deploying a ground force significant enough to take a mid-sized fortified city in the old reckoning. And behind those, spread in a wide tactical fan, the remaining hulls, frigates, fast attack craft, logistics ships. It was not a survey mission. It was not a retrieval operation. The formation was configured for an overwhelming initial strike followed by sustained planetary occupation. I had read enough doctrine analysis to recognize the shape of it. I logged the formation classification in the watch record. Ascendancy Imperial Enforcement Wing, Tier 1 configuration. Hostile intent assessed. High. At 0622 the transmission came. It arrived on the same abandonment-era contact frequency, and this time it was not a signal, but a message, structured, formatted with the protocol markers that indicated it was intended for a receiving intelligence of roughly equivalent technological sophistication to the sender. The compact's translation matrix had been built and refined over the course of decades, from the archived Veth linguistic samples gathered during the pre-abandonment occupation, and it turned the transmission in a comprehensible language in less than 4 minutes. I read the translation on my station screen, with my coffee growing cold beside me. The message informed us, and I used the word informed deliberately, because the tone of the original, the translation matrix flagged, was that of a superior addressing a subordinate. That the Veth Ascendancy had returned to reclaim the resource territory designated in Ascendancy chords as holding 7 Pale Descent, which was what they called Earth, and that any remnant population present would be required to present itself for census and classification within a period of 100 hours from the transmission timestamp. After 100 hours, the message stated, compliance would no longer be requested. It would be enforced. The message then provided a set of coordinates, a position in low orbit above the northern polar region, at which a delegation of any remnant population was invited to present itself and formally register its submission before the clock expired. That was the entirety of it. No greeting, no acknowledgement that 32,000 years had passed, no curiosity about what might have changed. They had left a resource territory behind them. They had returned to find it waiting, forwarded the translation to Commander Yevlanova, and then sat for a moment looking at the words on my screen. 100 hours. Check the station clock. It read 0624. Then I opened the platform's general system interface and began the preliminary checks for transitioning Bastion Kestrel from Condition 2 to Condition 1. 11 years of monthly drills. I could run the checklist in my sleep. At 0651, Commander Yevlanova convened the first cross-platform coordination call of what would become known, in the official record, as the 100-hour engagement. There were 43 platform commanders on the call, representing the full Kestrel ring, 16 orbital defense platforms, 8 deep strike platforms, 9 logistics and repair stations, and 10 of what were classified externally as research installations, but were, in the compact's actual organizational structure, forward fire control nodes. Every commander on the call had reviewed the translation. Every one of them was calm. Calm is the thing I want the record to capture correctly, because I think it could easily be misread as complacency or even arrogance. It was neither. It was the specific grounded calm of people who have spent their careers preparing for a contingency, and have now been informed that the contingency is 11 light minutes out and decelerating. The work was already done. It had been done before any of us were born. The 100 hours the Veth had given us were not, from our perspective, a deadline. They were a gift. The compact has acknowledged the transmission, Yevlanova said. No response has been sent yet. That decision sits above our tier. What we are tasked with for the next 24 hours is bringing everything in the Kestrel ring to full operational status and holding it there, without visible escalation. Without visible escalation, repeated Commander Aldrich from Platform 7. His tone was the dry kind that is a question without being a question. The Veth fleet is currently holding at a distance of approximately 60,000 kilometers beyond the lunar marker, Yevlanova said. They have not advanced. Their formation suggests they are waiting for a response to the ultimatum before committing to an orbital approach. As long as they're waiting, we have time. And the Meridian groups? Already moving into the lunar shadow. The Veth arrays almost certainly detected them transiting. You cannot hide a Meridian class in deep space. But the groups are moving on standard, troll vectors. Nothing that would read as preparation for engagement. I knew what she wasn't saying on an open call. The Meridian groups were not on standard patrol vectors. I had seen the fleet movement orders in the platform's restricted feed at 0558, 11 minutes before Yevlanova's call. 4 Meridian groups, 40 warships in total, were repositioning into a formation that would, in approximately 60 hours, place them in a dispersed arc on the far side of the Veth fleet's current position. They would not appear to be doing anything threatening. They would be establishing the northern jaw of a closing trap. The southern jaw was already in place. The Orbital Perimeter Defense, OPD, the permanent ring of fixed weapons platforms in medium Earth orbit that had been built over the course of 3 centuries and upgraded every generation since, was cycling to full power. Could feel it through the platform's sensor suite. Not literally, but in the way an experienced officer comes to read the electromagnetic signature of the platforms around them. The OPD was waking up quietly, in the way that something very large wakes when it has slept long enough and is not surprised by what it finds. At 0658, Platform 11's watch officer, Commander Dara Holt, raised a flag on the coordination channel. She had been running a parallel analysis of the Veth formation's deceleration profile, and had noted something that the initial scan had not foregrounded. The fleet's deceleration was more gradual than a direct high-confidence approach would warrant. Fleet coming in to execute a planetary occupation against a known low-resistance target would decelerate faster, hold its insertion burn for longer, and commit to an orbital approach timeline that minimized the window during which a defending force could respond. This fleet was decelerating at a pace that kept its options open, a pace consistent with a command that was not entirely confident in its mission. File. They're uncertain, Holt said. They've been uncertain since before they broadcast, Yevlanova replied. Gradual decel could be a reflection of incomplete intelligence on what they're approaching. They know they've been away a long time. They're being careful. Or they've already picked up enough on their approach scans to have some questions, said Commander Aldrich. Either way, Yevlanova said, it works for us. The less confident they are in the approach, the more time they'll spend in a holding posture rather than committing to an insertion burn. Use the time. I logged the decel analysis in the watch record. It would prove later to be one of the more prescient early reads of the situation. At 07:15, the platform's systems engineer, Chief Petty Officer Dalen Marsh, came to my station and placed a printed readiness sheet on my console without comment. Every watch officer on every platform got one, a physical summary of the platform's current operational status, a tradition that went back to the founding of the Kestrel Ring. When the communication infrastructure was new enough that platform commanders didn't fully trust digital-only readiness data, we still printed them. Some traditions earn their permanence. I read down the sheet. 7. The close defense battery array on the platform's port flank was at 91% readiness. One of the 12 fire control units was running a calibration cycle that Marsh had flagged as non-critical and estimated to complete by hour 8. The main long-range strike array was at full readiness. The platform's power core was at 100% and holding. Shields were at test charge, ready for full activation on command. I initialed the sheet and handed it back to Marsh. Good numbers, I said. Yes, sir, he said. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I turned back to the sensor plot. 71 hulls, holding position beyond the lunar marker, waiting for us to tell them we understood our situation. I watched the contact returns on the plot and thought about the people who had built this platform and the people before them who had built the OPD ring and the people before them who had dug the first underground archive into the bedrock of the eastern continent and sealed the records of the abandonment inside it with instructions to every subsequent generation. Do not forget what was done here. None of them had forgotten. Not one generation, for 32,000 years, had decided that the memory was too heavy to carry or the preparation too expensive to maintain. That is the thing that is hardest to convey to someone who was not present for those 100 hours. How completely the preparations had already been made. We were not scrambling. We were not improvising. We were not pulling together whatever we had on short notice and hoping it would be enough. The Veth had given us 100 hours, and we had used them, methodically, without hurry, without anything resembling panic, to complete the last fraction of a readiness posture that had been 99% complete before the first Lima 9 alert ever sounded. We were not building the fortress during the siege. We were opening the gates of a fortress that had been built while the enemy slept, and showing them, one carefully chosen room at a time, what 32,000 years of work looks like from the inside. At 08:30 station time, I handed off the watch to Lieutenant Karras and went to my quarters for a 4-hour rest period because Yevlanova had mandated rotation schedules for the duration and because I was no use to anyone exhausted. I lay on my bunk and looked at the ceiling for approximately 20 minutes before my body conceded and I slept. I dreamed of the deep scan arrays, sweeping their slow arcs through empty space, the way they had swept for 11 years, and of the night the sweep had finally come back wrong. I was back at my station, at 13. In the hours I had been off watch, two things had happened that Lieutenant Karras briefed me on with the crisp economy of someone who had spent the quiet hours processing a great deal of information and had organized it for efficient delivery. The first was that the Compact's Senior Council had transmitted a formal acknowledgement of the Veth message, not a submission, not a refusal, but an acknowledgement in the Veth diplomatic protocol format, using the archived linguistic structure of the pre-abandonment period, which told the Veth that the entity on the other end of the conversation was not a primitive remnant population that had stumbled across an old radio frequency, but someone who knew their language. The Compact's Council had included, at the end of the acknowledgement, a counter-notification, formal delegalo present itself at specified polar coordinates at the expiration of the 100-hour period as requested. The expiration, not before. The Veth had set the clock. The Compact was keeping it. The second thing was that the Veth fleet had advanced, not to orbital insertion distance, but closer. They were now at approximately 14,000 kilometers beyond the lunar marker, and their formation had tightened slightly, the enforcement carriers drawing in behind the lead vessel in a configuration that the Compact's doctrine library identified as a pre-orbital approach holding posture. They were reading the acknowledgement as submission, or at least as submission adjacent. They were positioning for a comfortable orbital descent once the clock expired and the delegation presented itself. Has the forward scan picked up any active targeting from the Veth formation? I asked. Passive scans, only from their end, Karras said. They're looking, not aiming. Good. Let them look. I settled into the watch and ran the first full diagnostic cycle of the afternoon shift. Platform systems were clean and holding. Grid 7's fire control unit had cleared its calibration cycle 3 hours ahead of Marsh's estimate. The main strike array had been bore-sighted against the secondary calibration beacon, a routine procedure, documented as routine in the maintenance log, which happened to leave the array perfectly aligned on a solution that, if the targeting computer were queried without any inputs from the watch officer, would automatically calculate a firing solution on the largest contact in the outer approach's sensor plot. I did not query the targeting computer. I noted the bore sight completion in the log and moved on. At 1440, I received a message from the platform's intelligence liaison, Lieutenant Commander Priya Santh, who was stationed on Deck 4 and spent her watch shifts, doing what I always privately thought of as the invisible work. The work that doesn't show up in the operational readiness logs, but that makes everything in the operational readiness logs possible. Sand had spent the last 10 hours running comparative analysis on the Veth fleet's emission signatures against the archived pre-abandonment sensor cords, cross-referencing drive profiles, power output characteristics, and communication encoding patterns to build a picture of how Veth technology had evolved in 32,000 years. Her message was 3 pages. The summary at the end was 1 paragraph. She had found what she expected to find. The Veth had advanced. Their drive technology was cleaner, communication encoding more sophisticated, their sensor resolution significantly sharper than the pre-abandonment records indicated. In pure technological terms, the fleet that had arrived today was more capable than any Veth force that had operated in this system before. The next sentence was, "It is still not enough." She had included the comparative analysis tables as appendices. I read them, with the attention they deserved, and then forwarded her message to Commander Yevlanova, with a single line of my own. San's assessment is sound. "Nothing here changes the picture," Yevlanova replied, agreed. "Log it and keep it in the working file." At 15:50, I received a restricted tier notice that the Compact's underground archive network, the system of hardened facilities distributed across 6 continents and 3 deep-sea installations maintained for the specific purpose of preserving the full historical record of the abandonment, and every piece of intelligence gathered on the Veth Ascendancy in the 32,000 years since, had transmitted a compiled briefing package to all senior Defense Command nodes. The package included a current intelligence assessment of Veth military capability based on the fleet's observed technical characteristics, a comparison against our own current capability, and a summary assessment at the end. The summary assessment was 3 sentences long. I read it once, put it in the back of my mind where it would stay for the next 80 hours, returned to the Wakach. At 17, the Veth fleet moved again. They advanced to within 6,000 kilometers of the lunar marker, what our doctrine classified as extended approach range, the distance at which a fleet of this size could commit to a full orbital insertion burn in approximately 4 hours. They were placing themselves at the starting line, waiting for the flag to drop. At 17:45, I picked up something on the close-range passive sensors that I almost dismissed as a calibration artifact before the second sweep confirmed it. A Veth scout vessel, small, fast, stealthed in the fashion that Veth light reconnaissance craft had been stealthed in the archived pre-abandonment, words which meant a specific sensor baffling coding that worked extremely well against most sensor modalities of 30,000 years ago, had separated from the main fleet and was moving on a wide arc toward Earth, toward us specifically. Not a weapons run, an observation pass. They were sending eyes ahead to look at what they were coming to claim. I watched the scout vessel's track on the sensor plot for 47 minutes, as it curved around the lunar far side and began its inward approach. It was running dark, the steel thing active, moving at the speed of something that expects not to be seen. I did not activate any of the platform's active sensors. I tracked it on passives only and said nothing on the open coordination channel. The scout vessel made its pass at a distance of approximately 40,000 kilometers from the OPD ring, close enough for a very good sensor suite to pick up the orbital platforms, the weapons arrays, the power signatures of the meridian groups now repositioned in the lunar shadow, and the general electromagnetic signature of a civilization that had not been sitting quietly in a cave for 32,000 years. Pass lasted 11 minutes. Then the scout vessel turned and ran hard back toward the fleet. I did not watch it go. I was already looking at the sensor plot downstream of its observation angle, calculating what it would have seen and in what order. The OPD ring's outer tier, the 16 fixed position heavy platforms in the highest orbit, would have been the first thing to register. They cast a power signature at full charge that is approximately 8 times the output of the next most powerful single orbital installation humanity has ever built. The scout would have registered that and spent the next several minutes trying to reconcile it with whatever the briefing had said. the target planet's technology level should be. Then, it would have resolved the meridian groups in the lunar shadow. Then, if its sensor suite had sufficient resolution for a 40,000-kilometer standoff scan, it might have resolved the thorn wall on the surface. The great mountain spine defense network that is not subtle, that was never designed to be subtle, that is designed to be seen clearly from orbit and read correctly. 40 minutes later, the Veth fleet's formation changed. It was subtle, a slight increase in the spacing between the enforcement carriers and the lead vessel, a reorientation of two of the heavy escorts to cover angles they had not previously covered. The kind of formation adjustment that does not mean retreat, but means recalculation. The kind of adjustment a force makes when the preliminary reconnaissance has returned data that does not match the mission briefing. I logged the formation change in the watch record and added a note. Veth Scout Observation Pass appears to have prompted tactical reassessment. Assessment of human defensive capability underway. Recommend no change to platform posture. Commander Yevlanova acknowledged the log note with a single word, agreed. The hours passed. I want to be precise about what the next 60 hours felt like from the station, because I think the accounts that will eventually be written about this period will be tempted to compress it into a montage of dramatic moments, and that compression would misrepresent something important about how it actually unfolded. There were no dramatic moments. There was a very long period of work, methodical, disciplined, unhurried, during which people who had trained for this contingency for their entire years executed the preparations they had been trained to execute. Every battery in the OPD ring reached full charge by hour 31 and held it. Power draw was, from outside the ring, perfectly consistent with a standard high-demand maintenance cycle, the kind that the ring ran twice a year as a matter of scheduled protocol. We had scheduled 1-2 weeks from now. We simply ran it early. The Meridian groups completed their repositioning by hour 36. 40 warships in a dispersed arc, approximately 800,000 kilometers behind, and to the ecliptic north of the Veth fleet's current position. Each group holding at minimal emission, weapons powered but not charged, drives at station-keeping thrust, active sensors off. From the Veth fleet's perspective, if they were scanning carefully, they would see 40 contacts on a dispersed patrol arc, well outside engagement range. That was precisely what we wanted them to see. At hour 38, Chief Marsh brought me another printed readiness sheet. 7 was at 100%. Main strike array holding bore sight. Power core stable. He stood at my station for a moment longer than the delivery required. "Something on your mind, Chief," I said. He was quiet for a second. He was about 52 years old, heavy-shouldered, with the unhurried manner of a man who had been doing his job long enough that competence had settled in him like ballast. He had been on Bastion Kestrel for 6 years, 2 years longer than the average tour length for a systems engineer. He had never told me why he'd stayed, and I had never asked. "My grandmother used to say they'd come back," he said. Her grandmother told her. It was the kind of thing that got passed down. I waited. She didn't know when, he said. None of them ever knew when. They just kept saying it. Every generation. "They'll come back. Make sure we're ready." "We're ready," I said. He picked up the readiness sheet, turned it once in his hands, it back on my console. "Yes, sir," he said, and went back to his station. That exchange stayed with me. I have thought about it many times since. Marsh's grandmother, passing down a warning in the way that warnings get passed, not through institutional cords or formal briefings, but at kitchen tables and in the margins of remembered conversation, in the kind of language that is not precise enough to appear in any official archive, but that carries something the archive cannot. She did not know when. She did not know how. She knew only what the archive knows in its formal clinical language. It happened, and it could happen again, and someone needs to be watching. Someone was always watching. That is the whole of it, in the end. That is what 32,000 years of preparation means at the human scale, reduced to its plainest form. Someone was always watching, and the watch was never abandoned. And when the deep scan array finally came back wrong, there was a full readiness report, sitting on every watch station in the Kestrel ring, printed and initialed, and every number on every sheet was good. That exchange stayed with me. I have thought about it many times since. Marsh's grandmother, passing down a warning in the way that warnings get passed. Not through institutional records or formal briefings, at kitchen tables and in the margins of remembered conversation, in the kind of language that is not precise enough to appear in any official archive, but that carries something the archive cannot. She did not know when. She did not know how. She knew only what the archive knows in its formal clinical language. It happened, and it could happen again. And someone needs to be watching. Someone was always watching. That is the whole of it, in the end. That is what 32,000 years of preparation means at the human scale, reduced to its plainest form. Someone was always watching, and the watch was never abandoned. And when the deep scan array finally came back wrong, there was a full readiness report sitting on every watch station in the Kestrel ring, printed and initialed, and every number on every sheet was good. At hour 20, the Veth fleet transmitted a short pulse on the contact frequency. Not a message, just a carrier signal, the kind that a communication system sends when it is running a handshake check. Testing whether the frequency was still monitored, whether anything was still listening. Lieutenant Karras, who was finishing her first stint of watch duties while I handled the coordination calls, caught the pulse on the traffic log and flagged it to me without comment. I looked at it and looked at the timestamp and thought about the calculation the fleet commander must be running. He had sent the 100-hour ultimatum 6 hours ago. He had received a formal acknowledgement. Perked. Now. He was checking whether the acknowledgement had come from a system that was still active and monitoring, or from an automated response protocol on an otherwise dead installation. He needed to know whether there was someone home. I did not respond to the carrier pulse. Responding to a carrier pulse would tell him too much, too early. We had given him the answer he needed in the acknowledgement. Someone was home, and someone spoke his language, and there was nothing to be gained from elaborating on that before the Council's communication strategy was ready. Pulse ran for 4 minutes and 20 seconds and then stopped. At hour 23, Platform 8 reported a passive sensor contact. Faint, brief, consistent with a small high-velocity object, transiting through the outer approach zone on a vector that would take it across the lunar marker in approximately 6 hours. The contact was not a vessel. It was too small, too fast, and moving on a ballistic trajectory rather than a driven one. The preliminary analysis identified it as a probe, the kind that advanced military organizations launched of a main fleet to provide improved sensor resolution on the approach zone. Platform 8 had cataloged 3 earlier, Veth probe, transits in the last 72 hours of approach. This was the 4th. Each one had passed closer to Earth than the previous. The 4th probe was going to pass close enough to Earth to collect high-resolution, atmospheric and electromagnetic data, the kind of data that would tell the Veth fleet what the planet's power budget was, what the distribution of industrial capacity looked like from a spectral analysis standpoint, and whether the electromagnetic signature of the OPD ring's charging cycle matched any known defensive architecture in their reference database. I checked the tracking plot for the probe's projected trajectory. It would pass within 32,000 kilometers of the OPD ring's outer tier. At that distance, a well-designed probe sensor suite would get a very clear picture of what it was looking at. Do we intercept? Platform 3's commander on the coordination channel. No, said Yevlenova. Let it run. It's going to tell them a great deal. Yes, Yevlenova said. That is acceptable. We want them to know what they're looking at. We want them to know before they commit to anything irreversible. Probe is helping us. That exchange captured the logic of the next 70-odd hours in a single pair of statements. We were not trying to conceal what we were. We were trying to ensure the Veth understood what they were looking at before they made a decision that not be walked back. A fleet that fires on an orbital defense platform because it doesn't know what the platform can do is a fleet that has made irreversible decision based on incomplete information. A fleet that fires because it knows exactly what the platform can do and decides to engage anyway is a different problem. But it is a smaller problem than the first, because it means the engagement, if it comes, is deliberate. And a deliberate engagement by a fleet that has had 96 hours to look at the full scope of what they're engaging is a fleet that has made a calculation. and our assessment was that the calculation would not favor engagement. The probe made its pass at hour 29, flew through the outer OPD tier, collected its data, and continued on its way without incident. I tracked it until it passed below platform Kestrel's sensor horizon. What we did not want the Veth to see, and what they did not see, because the geometry and the passive scan limitations of their sensor suite combined to keep it hidden, were the 6-gate platform vessels, repositioning into the deep shadow sectors behind the outer gas giants. The gate platforms were not warships. They were something else, something that had taken 90 years to build, and another 40 years to fully understand how to operate, and which the Compact's senior council had not unveiled publicly because there had never been a reason to unveil it publicly. Until now, I knew about the gate platforms from my restricted tier clearance. Most of the population of Earth did not. Even most of the officers in the Kestrel Ring did not know the full capability. We knew what we needed to know, which was that at hour 90, 6 very large structures were going to arrive at specific coordinates in a ring formation around the Veth fleet, and that after that, the Veth fleet would have certain options available to it, and certain options that would no longer be available. At hour 40, the Veth fleet transmitted again. This transmission was not on the general contact frequency. It was targeted. A directed beam aimed at the OPD ring's central relay, which meant they had identified it as a command node. The translation matrix turned it in 3 minutes. The message asked, in terms that were more interrogative than the first transmission's certainty, had been for a status update on the delegation's preparation. The Compact's council sent back a 2-line response. The delegation was being prepared. It would present itself at the specified coordinates, at the specified time. The Veth did not respond to that, but the formation changed again. The heavy escorts drew slightly closer to the lead vessel, and the enforcement carriers shifted their alignment in a way that the Doctrine Library identified as a defensive reorientation. They were no longer thinking purely about occupation posture. They were thinking about what they might be walking into. Good. Let them think. At hour 47, I was in the middle of the watch change briefing when Platform 4's Lieutenant Commander OC flagged an anomaly in the Veth fleet's electromagnetic emissions. He had been running a continuous passive spectral analysis of the fleet's power signature for the last 18 hours, looking for the specific frequency bands associated with weapons charging, and he had found something that was not weapons charging, but was notable for a different reason. Several of the Veth vessels, he estimated 4 to 6 hulls based on the emission profile, were running what appeared to be intensive scan cycles against the lunar surface. "Why the moon?" asked Commander Aldrich on the coordination channel. "Because that's where our archive installation is," I said, before I'd consciously decided to say it. There was a brief silence on the channel. "They're looking for records," said Yevlanova, voice even. "Pre-abandonment survey data. They had installations on the lunar surface during the occupation period. They're checking whether any of them are still there." "They're trying to calibrate how much has changed," Aldrich said. "Yes. The Veth found the old installation footprints. The structures themselves were long gone, removed 4,000 years after the abandonment, catalogued, studied, and then dismantled for materials. But the survey data scars in the regolith were still there, the ghostly impressions of foundation anchors and power conduit trenches that even 32 millennia of micrometeorite bombardment had not fully erased. The Veth would know those scars. They had put them there, and around those old scars, if they were scanning at sufficient resolution, and based on the emission profile, OC assessed that they would be seeing the new constructions, the relay infrastructure, the deep scan array mountings, the hardened data relay bunker that sat 2 kilometers from the old Veth installation footprint, built in what I had always privately considered a deliberate architectural statement by whatever engineer had chosen the site. At hour 53, the Veth fleet advanced again. They crossed the lunar marker by approximately 3,000 kilometers. Not a commitment to orbital insertion, probe. Testing to see if the advance would trigger a response from the OPD. It did not trigger a visible response. The OPD batteries held their charge and their silence. The Meridian groups held their positions. The Watch officers on every platform in the Kestrel Ring watched the Veth advance on their sensor plots and recorded it in the watch log, and did not reach for activation switches. I watched the Veth advance and felt the pull that I imagine every watch officer on every platform felt in that moment, trained instinct to act, to respond to an incursion with the response the incursion had earned. It is a real pull. It is not something you can fully reason your way out of. You manage it. You hold the weight of it in your hands, and you feel how heavy it is, and you set it down again, because the standing orders say hold, and because you understand what the standing orders are protecting. The next 47 hours, the space in which the Fifth Fleet would arrive at its own conclusions, without the pressure of an immediate engagement, forcing it into a posture that not be reversed. At hour 54, I did something I had not done once in the first 53 hours of the engagement. Walked to the observation window on the platform's command deck port side, and looked at the space between us and the lunar marker with my own eyes, rather than through the sensor plot. There was nothing to see, of course. The Veth fleet was 110,000 kilometers away, invisible at that distance without instruments. The space between us and them was empty vacuum and starlight, and the faint blue-white arc of the lunar horizon. But I stood there for approximately 3 minutes and looked at it anyway. I have a theory about why, not a complex theory, just the observation that after 54 hours of watching symbols move on a screen, there is something that a person's mind requires from the direct unmediated view. Something about registering, at the level of the body rather than the analytical mind, the fact that the space being defended is real, that the planet below is real, that the people in the arcologies and the coastal cities and the Thornwall installations and the underground archives, people who built all of this and maintain it and live inside it, they are real. And the thing that has been in the outer approaches for 54 hours is real. And the only thing standing between those two realities is the preparedness we have been building for 32,000 years, and the discipline we have been exercising for the last 2.25 days, 3 minutes. Then I went back to the sensor plot. At hour 56, the Veth transmitted a third time, longer than the previous messages. The translation matrix took 9 minutes. The third transmission was, in essence, a demand for clarification, in language that was more careful, more measured. Than the first ultimatum's assumption of dominance, the Veth fleet commander asked several questions. They asked for a count of the current human population. They asked for a description of the defensive installations the fleet's scans had identified. They asked specifically for an explanation of the power sources associated with the OPD ring, which their sensor analysis had apparently assessed as larger than anything in their own capability reference database. They were asking us to explain what we had become. The Compact's council took 2 hours to compose the response to the third transmission. I read the response when it went out at hour 58. It was 6 paragraphs long, the longest communication we had sent, and it was, in the specifically careful language of people who have thought very hard about exactly what to say, a complete and accurate answer to every question the Veth had asked. We told them our population count, 11 billion on world, approximately 40 million distributed across installations beyond Earth's atmosphere. We described the defensive installations, their number, their distribution, the broad categories of their capability. We explained the OPD power sources. We told them, precise terms drawn from the archive, that since the abandonment 32,000 years ago, no portion of the recorded history of what was done to this world during the occupation period had been forgotten. We told them that the preparation they were now observing had been ongoing in one form or another since the first generation after the abandonment and had been refining itself with each generation since. We did not threaten them. We did not list our weapons or their yields or their ranges. We simply described, accurately and completely, what they were looking at. We let the description carry its own weight. At hour 61, the Veth fleet stopped advancing and held position at 3,000 kilometers beyond the lunar marker. I watched the formation on the sensor plot and understood that somewhere in the lead vessel's command node, a conversation was happening that was very different from whatever conversation had taken place when this fleet departed. And wherever they had from, Whenever they had been dispatched, their mission briefing had told them they were going to an abandoned resource territory to reassert ownership. The conversation happening now was something else entirely. I thought about the mission briefing they must have carried. 2,000 years was not a short absence. Whatever records the Veth Ascendancy held of this system, whatever they had filed away about, holding 7 pale distant after the abandonment, would have been records of a diminished world. Records of a population that had been, by the time the Veth left, a fraction of what it had once been. A world without orbital infrastructure, without heavy industry, without the organizational capacity to project force beyond its own atmosphere. That was the world in the mission briefing. That was the world the fleet commander had expected to find. Instead, he had found us. And somewhere in the long math of 32,000 years, the Veth's intelligence apparatus had apparently not updated the file. We had spent 32,000 years not updating ours. At hour 64, I was off watch again. I spent the rest period in the observation lounge on the platform's outer ring, a long room with a viewport that ran almost the full circumference, the kind of extravagance that defense platforms rarely build, but that some administrator 40 years ago had apparently decided was worth the structural cost, and I had been grateful for that administrator's decision many times in 11 years. I sat in the observer's chair and looked at Earth. From the Kestrel ring's orbital altitude on the night side, you saw the planet the way it is meant to be seen. Not as a collection of individual places and problems and political borders, as a single object, lit from within by the accumulated work of billions of people over tens of thousands of years. The city lights that were visible from here were not the soft, scattered glow of a civilization feeling its way forward. They were the hard, organized brilliance of a civilization that had organized itself comprehensively and built on the organization of every prior generation. You could see, from here, the great archaeology complexes on the continental coasts. You could see the spine of the Thornwall defensive range that ran the full length of the central mountain chain on the eastern continent, its relay towers blinking their slow navigation pulses. You could see, if you knew where to look, the launch signatures of the orbital ascent platform on the southern coast. The platform that had been launching supply runs to the Kestrel ring every 36 hours for the last century and a half without a break. I had looked at Earth from this window hundreds of times in 11 years. I had looked at it the way you look at anything you see every day, registering it, cataloging it, not quite seeing it. I was seeing it now. The engagement had done that. 64 hours of watching 71 foreign hulls sit in the outer approaches had done something to the quality of my attention, had pulled me out of the habitual and dropped me back into the literal, so that the planet below was no longer a backdrop to the work, but the reason for the work. And the two things had reconnected in the way they connect when something real is at stake. I thought about the first people who had looked up after the abandonment and decided that what had happened would not happen again. They had not had this platform. They had not had the OPD ring, or the Meridian groups, or the gate platforms, or the Thornwall. They had had a damaged world and a number of surviving people, and the weight of what they had endured, and out of those things they had made the decision that every subsequent generation had renewed. We will remember, and we will be ready, and when they come back, if they come back, they will not find what they left. 32,000 years of work, 32,000 years of people waking up every morning on a world that had been occupied and diminished and abandoned, and deciding that what had been done to this world was something they would remember, and something they would not allow again. Not out of rage, not even out of grief, though there had been grief in the early centuries. Rage and grief, and the kind of disorganized fear that produces monuments, instead of fortifications. But those phases had passed. What came after them was quieter and more durable. It was the understanding that memory is only useful if it is organized, that preparation is only effective if it is sustained, and that a civilization that keeps both things continuously alive for 32,000 years becomes eventually something that a force of 71 warships is not equipped to handle. The Veth had given us 100 hours. Compact had been given 32,000 years. I sat in the observer's chair for 2 hours and 20 minutes. and then went back to my bunk and slept easily. Hour 72:04:17 station time of the third day, a small symmetry that I noted but did not remark on in the log. The Veth fleet transmitted again. This transmission was not on the contact frequency. It was on the compact's designated open diplomatic channel, the channel whose existence and address we had included in our Hour 58 response. Using the channel was a statement in itself. They were no longer treating this as a notification to a subordinate population. They were opening a negotiation. The translation came back in 6 minutes. The transmission was from the fleet commander directly. The first transmission to identify a specific sender, and it asked for a direct communication link. Not a broadcast message, a conversation. The Compact's senior counsel approved the direct link at Hour 73. The conversation was conducted through the translation matrix in both directions, with a 12-second lag on each exchange due to the distance. I did not have a direct feed to the conversation's content. I had a summary feed, flagged excerpts that the Compact's communication analysts assessed as operationally relevant to platform commanders. The first excerpt came through at Hour 74. The fleet commander had asked, directly, without diplomatic circumlocution, how long the OPD ring had been in its current operational configuration. Compact's council representative answered, the ring had been in continuous operation for 140 years in its current configuration. Earlier versions of the ring had been in operation for 900 years before that. The second excerpt came at Hour 75. Fleet commander had asked about the Meridian groups. The council representative answered accurately. 40 warships. Standard defensive patrol configuration. There was a pause in the exchange. The communication analysts estimated 14 minutes of silence on the Veth end between the council representative's answer and the next transmission. 14 minutes since the fleet commander processed the information that what had appeared to be a standard patrol was in fact 40 warships in a position that any competent military navigator could now calculate was approximately 200,000 kilometers to his north and closing on an intercept geometry that would complete itself in roughly 20 hours. Not aggressively, not quickly, but closing. The third excerpt was longer. The fleet commander had asked, and the translation matrix flagged this as a significant tonal departure from the formal transmission language, something more direct, more unguarded. Why? Why had a population that had been left behind, reduced, and abandoned, spent 32,000 years, preparing for a return that might never have come? The council representative's answer to that question was the one I read 3 times. Because it might come, she said. That is sufficient reason. There was a pause in the feed after that exchange. The communication analysts were flagging a longer gap, not a transmission delay, but the fleet commander's silence before he sent the next message. The matrix logged it at 19 minutes. I imagined what 19 minutes of silence meant on the Veth end of that conversation. The fleet commander in his command node, a being whose civilization had held this system as a resource territory for 4,000 years, and then walked away from it, and apparently not thought about it very seriously for the 32,000 years since, trying to reckon with the fact that the people they had left behind had spent every one of those 32,000 years thinking about very little else. It was not a comfortable reckoning. I didn't need to be Veth to understand that. Hour 76, the fleet commander asked about the lunar archive installation. The hardened bunker that his probe surveys had resolved at 40,000 kilometers on the Hour 29 pass. He asked specifically what was in it. The council representative answered, a complete record of the occupation period. Everything that was done and when and how. Every generation since the abandonment had added to it. It was the most complete external record of Veth Ascendancy activity in this system that existed anywhere. She said it without emphasis, without accusation. She described the archive as one might describe any administrative facility, its location, its function, its age. She did not need to do anything else with it. The weight of what she was describing was already present in the description itself. The fleet commander's next question, after another pause of some minutes, was whether the archive had been used to build the defensive systems currently surrounding his fleet. In part, the council representative said, The archive contributed to the engineering specifications that informed certain long-range systems. The rest was independent development. In part, the fleet commander said. Yes, the council representative said. 32,000 years of independent development accounts for a great deal. At hour 78, Lieutenant Commander Sand sent me a follow-up to her hour 14 analysis. She had spent the intervening hours running a secondary comparison, this time not between the Veth's capability and ours, between the Veth's capability now and their capability as projected forward from the pre-abandonment records. She wanted to understand not just where they were, but how fast they had been advancing. The answer was that they had advanced at roughly the pace our models had projected. Soon's models, built from the 32,000 years of intermittent Veth contact data that the archive had accumulated, including 3 confirmed Veth survey passes of the outer system in the last 8,000 years, all of which had been detected and logged and not interfered with, had predicted a technological advancement curve. The fleet that had arrived was consistent with that curve, which meant that our own advancement had not been modeled against a static adversary. It had been modeled against a moving one, and it had outpaced that moving target by a margin that Sand did not express as a percentage because she said percentages would understate the difference. I filed her report in the working file and added a note. Council briefing package conclusion confirmed independently. Proceed as planned. At hour 80, the Veth fleet's formation changed in a way that every watch officer in the Kestrel Ring noticed simultaneously. The enforcement carriers, the 14 box hulls configured for ground force deployment, shifted from their position behind the heavy escorts to a position flanking the lead vessel. It was not an aggressive redeployment. It was the reconfiguration of vessels that were no longer holding an occupation posture and were instead holding a position that the Doctrine Library, when I queried it, classified as a lateral defensive alignment. They were protecting the command vessel's flanks, not preparing to descend. At hour 83, the gate platforms arrived. I watched them emerge from their transit on the long-range sensor plot, 6 large contacts, each appearing at the precise coordinates they had been positioned for, distributed in a ring around the Veth fleet's current position at a distance, approximately 200,000 kilometers. They were not weapons platforms. They did not charge anything. They simply appeared and held position and radiated the low-frequency navigation pulse. That was their operational signature when idle. On the Veth fleet side of the exchange, the response was immediate. All active emissions from the fleet went to minimum. Every vessel went to low power hold. The formation tightened, not aggressively, but the way a formation tightens, when the commander has ordered everyone to stop moving and hold still and let the situation develop. The gate platforms had not threatened them. They had not aimed anything at them. They had simply appeared in a ring around. A fleet that had spent 3 days believing it was operating in a space that it controlled, and by their presence had demonstrated that this belief was incorrect. At hour 84, the fleet commander transmitted again. The excerpt the communication analysts forwarded to platform commanders was brief. The fleet commander asked what the 6 contacts were. Council representative answered with a technical description that I will not reproduce in this record because portions of it remain restricted. The description was accurate and complete. After it concluded, the council representative added one sentence that was not restricted and that I have since read in the public version of the engagement record. She said, "We built them so that we would never again be unable to close a door." At hour 85, the Veth fleet's direct communication link went quiet. 22 minutes of silence. I watched the sensor plot during those 22 minutes and did not leave my station. At hour 85 and 22 minutes, Fleet Commander responded. The excerpt was 2 sentences. He said he needed to understand the boundaries of the current situation. He asked whether the compact's intent was to hold the fleet in its current position or to destroy it. Neither, the council representative said. The intent is to demonstrate that the situation has changed since your mission was briefed, and to ensure that the demonstration is clearly communicated before any decision is made that cannot be reversed. The fleet commander asked how long they had to make a decision. Until the 100-hour mark, the council representative said. That was your clock. We have kept it. There were 15 hours remaining. I handed off the watch to Lieutenant Karras at hour 86 and told her that I would be back. She looked at me for a moment and then nodded, understanding the arithmetic. I ate a full meal in the station mess, the first complete meal I had eaten since hour 1, and sat at a table with Commander Yevlanova and 2 of the other senior watch officers from platforms 3 and 11. We did not discuss the engagement. We talked about other things. Yevlana Dodge's finishing her engineering certification at the Thornwall Academy, the long-running dispute between platforms 3 and 11, about which of their galley staffs made the better braised protein, dispute that had been running for at least 4 years and showed no sign of resolution. We ate and talked, and the hours passed. The mess was quiet at that hour, most of the off-duty staff in their quarters. Cook had left a pot of something warm on the serving counter with a handwritten card that said, "Help yourself. You've earned it." I don't know when she wrote it. It was there when I arrived and I didn't ask. Some people express things in small, practical gestures because the full expression is too large for direct statement, and that Cook had found the right form. We ate. The food was good. The hours passed. At hour 94, Karras flagged me on the personal comm. The Veth fleet had transmitted again, not through the direct link, but on the open diplomatic channel. The message was brief. The fleet commander stated that the Veth Ascendancy fleet had completed its preliminary assessment of the current situation and was prepared to accept a formal communication from the Compact's senior council at the Compact's convenience. Karras's message to me contained just that summary, and below it, a single line of her own. I think that's as close to asking for a meeting as they get. I sent back. Tell Commander Yevlanova, I'll be at my station at hour 98. At hour 98, I was at my station. I had been there since hour 97, because an 11-year watch officer does not rely on the rotation schedule when the last 2 hours of a 100-hour countdown are running. The sensor plot was unchanged. The Veth fleet held its position, formation tight, all emissions minimal. The gate platforms held their ring. The OPD held its charge. The Meridian groups held their arc in the lunar shadow. Every component of the defense structure that had been moving and adjusting and positioning for 4 days was still, now, everything that needed to be in position was in position. The Compact's council had accepted the fleet commander's request for a formal communication. The channel was open. The translation matrix was active. The 100-hour clock showed 2 hours and 17 minutes remaining. I listened to the exchange through the summary feed. The fleet commander spoke first. He stated that the Veth Ascendancy had dispatched its fleet based on survey records from the period of occupation, records that indicated a population reduced to a level that would not be capable of organized resistance, and a technological level that would not represent a significant engagement risk. He stated that the survey records were clearly no longer accurate. The council representative acknowledged that the survey records were no longer accurate. She did not elaborate on the degree to which they were no longer accurate, because the degree had already been demonstrated, and elaboration was unnecessary. The fleet commander asked about the Compact's intentions regarding the Veth Ascendancy. The council representative's answer took 7 minutes to deliver, and the full content was not in the summary feed. The excerpt I received was 3 sentences from the closing of her statement. She said that the Compact had no territorial claims against the Veth Ascendancy, no interest in pursuing armed conflict against Veth-held systems, and no intention of taking any action against this fleet provided the fleet's conduct remained consistent with its conduct over the past 4 days. She said that the Compact's interest was singular and had always been singular. She said that the Compact's interest was in ensuring that what was done to this world during the occupation would not happen again. This interest had driven 32,000 years of preparation, and that the Compact considered the preparation successful. The fleet commander was quiet for 90 seconds, long enough that the communication analyst sent a check pulse to confirm the channel was still active. Then he asked one more question. He asked whether the Compact would permit the fleet to withdraw. The council representative said yes. She said, The compact had always been prepared to permit the fleet to withdraw. She said the only thing the compact had not been prepared to permit was the fleet's original mission. The 100-hour clock reached 0 at 06:37 station time on the fourth day. The Veth fleet began its withdrawal burn at 6:41. They moved slowly, not because their drives were slow, but because a formation of 71 vessels, departing a space ringed by gate platforms, and watched by an orbital defense system of the scale that now understood us to possess, does not move quickly, and does not make any gesture that could be read as anything other than exactly what it is. They were careful. They were methodical. They held their formation with the discipline of professional military spacers who understood that the situation required exactness, and they gave us no reason to question their intent. I watched the withdrawal on the sensor plot for 2 hours. Yevlanova stood at the adjacent station, her arms crossed, her face exactly as composed as it had been on the first call 4 days ago when she had said, "Send it up the chain, all tears, now." At 09:30 the Veth fleet crossed back over the lunar marker. At 11:17 they reached the distance at which our deep scan arrays had first detected their approach. At 13:44 they initiated the high transit burn that would take them back out through the outer approaches, and eventually, presumably, to wherever they had come from. Lima 9 watched them go. Lima 8 and Lima 11 confirmed. Logged the final sensor contact in the watch record and appended the engagement summary. Veth Ascendancy Imperial Enforcement Wing, Tier 1 configuration, arrived. Held position for 4 days, 1 hour, 27 minutes. Withdrew without engagement. All Kestrel ring platforms nominal. No rounds fired, no casualties, no damage. I stared at that last line for a moment before I submitted the log. No rounds fired, no casualties, no damage. 11 years of watching the deep scan arrays sweep empty space. And when the sweep finally came back wrong, this is what the preparation of 32,000 years looked like from the inside. Not a battle, not a siege, not a desperate last stand with the weight of the whole species riding on the actions of a few. Just 100 hours of quiet, methodical work, and a fleet of 71 ships discovering that the thing they had come to reclaim was no longer the thing they remembered, had not been that thing for longer than their civilization kept continuous records, and was not going to become that thing again. Commander Yevlanova shut down her station display and turned to me. She looked the way I felt. Not triumphant, not relieved, in some way that I struggled to name precisely and have thought about many times since. The word that comes closest, when I settle on it, is satisfied. Not pleased with ourselves. Not proud in the way that invites repetition of the word. Satisfied the way a person is satisfied. When a thing they have worked on carefully for a very long time works exactly as it was meant to work. "Watch," she said. "Watch," I said. She walked out of the command room, and I turned back to my station and began filling out the post. Engagement Readiness Report. Because the OPD ring would need to cycle down from full charge in an orderly sequence, Feet and the Meridian groups would need routing orders for their return to standard patrol disposition, and the gate platforms would need their operational transferred to the archive before they moved back to their holding positions, and Bastion Kestrel itself would need a full systems inspection before we could step down from Condition 1. There was a great deal of work to do. There always is, when you are one of the people responsible for keeping this world ready. Pulled up the first form on my screen and started filling it in. Outside the viewport, 32,000 years of preparation held its breath for the first time in a very long time, and then, slowly, without ceremony, exhaled.